I still remember the day the invitation arrived. A fancy gold-embossed envelope with my name written in perfect cursive. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My stepmother and I were never close, and after my father passed, things got worse. She and her daughter, Clara, always treated me like an outsider, like I didn't belong in their world. So why would she invite me to her birthday gala? I almost threw the invitation away, but something stopped me. A part of me wondered if maybe, just maybe, she wanted to make peace. Maybe the years of cold stares and passive-aggressive comments were over. Maybe losing my father had made her realize that life was too short for grudges. I should have known better. Still, I convinced myself to go. I even bought a beautiful dress, something elegant but not flashy. I didn't want to stand out too much, I just wanted to be there, to see if things had changed. As I arrived at the venue, I felt an uneasy weight settle in my stomach. The place was extravagant, chandeliers sparkling, waiters carrying trays of expensive champagne. Everything screamed wealth and power, just like my stepmother loved. The moment I walked in, the whispers started. People turned their heads, giving me side glances. Some smiled, but it wasn't the warm kind of smile. It was the polite, fake kind that hid judgment. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overthinking. Then I saw my stepmother. Dressed in an expensive gown, she stood in the center of the room, sipping her drink like a queen at her throne. Clara was right beside her, her arm hooked around some rich guy's. When my stepmother spotted me, she smiled, but something in her eyes felt off. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't kindness. It was something else, something calculating. I should have turned around and left right then. But I stayed, because a part of me still wanted to believe that maybe this night was going to be different, that maybe, after everything, she had finally accepted me as family. I was wrong. I was standing near the bar, sipping my drink, trying to blend into the background. I wasn't here to cause trouble. I wasn't here to make a scene. I just wanted to see if maybe, for once, my stepmother had invited me with good intentions. Then she grabbed the microphone. The room quieted almost instantly. The chatter died down and all eyes turned to her. At first, I thought she was about to make a speech, maybe thank the guests for coming, but the way she looked at me made my stomach drop. "This girl," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through the air like a knife, "stole what belongs to my daughter." I froze. It took me a second to even understand what she had just said. My stepmother's voice echoed in the grand ballroom, bouncing off the chandeliers, hitting me like a slap to the face. The room was full of powerful, wealthy people, people who respected her, people who would believe whatever she said. The whispers started immediately. Murmurs rippled through the crowd like a wave, and I could feel their stares burning into me. Some shocked, some disgusted, some just curious. I could hear someone gasp. Someone else muttered, "Is that true?" I turned my head and saw Clara, my stepsister, standing right beside her. Her lower lip trembled, and she blinked rapidly as if she were holding back tears. But I knew her better than that. Those weren't real tears. She was playing the victim, just like always. I opened my mouth to say something, anything. But my throat felt dry. My heart pounded in my chest so loudly that it drowned out my thoughts. My stepmother continued, her voice full of fake sorrow. "My husband built that business with his own hands. He wanted it to stay in the family, to be passed down to the daughter who deserved it. And yet she pointed at me again, took it for herself." The murmurs grew louder. A few guests shook their heads at me. Others looked at me as if I was some sort of criminal. I felt sick. This wasn't just an accusation. It was a public humiliation, a perfectly planned attack. She wanted to turn everyone against me, to paint me as the villain in front of people who mattered. I clenched my fists. I wanted to scream that she was lying, that my father left the business to me in his will, that I hadn't stolen anything. But the way the crowd looked at me told me it wouldn't matter. They had already made up their minds. And then the first boo rang out. It started with one voice, then another and another. The noise grew, the disapproval washing over me like crashing waves. I felt hands on my arms, security. Before I could even process what was happening, I was being dragged toward the exit, the sound of jeers and whispers following me. I had come here hoping for change. Instead, I had been thrown out like a thief. At first, the whispers were just murmurs, soft and scattered. But then they grew louder. I could hear them all around me, sharp and cruel. Unbelievable. How could she do that to her own family? I always knew there was something off about her. And then the booing started. It was just one voice at first. A man near the front shaking his head like he was disappointed in me. Then another. And another. Soon it felt like the whole room was against me, their voices blending into one overwhelming wave of rejection. I stood there, frozen. My hands trembled at my sides, my heart pounding so hard it hurt. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them they were wrong, that this was all a lie, but my throat was dry, my voice completely lost in the noise. Then I felt hands on my arms. Firm, rough. Security. I barely had time to react before they started pulling me toward the exit. My heels scraped against the marble floor as I stumbled, trying to keep up. I turned my head, searching the crowd for someone, anyone, who might stand up for me. But no one did. Even the people I had known for years, the ones who had once smiled at me, looked away like they didn't want to be associated with me. My stepmother stood at the front, watching it all unfold with a satisfied smirk. Clara clung to her, still pretending to be the poor, heartbroken victim. I wanted to fight back. I wanted to shove the guards away, stand my ground and make them listen. But I knew it wouldn't work. These people didn't care about the truth. They cared about power, about reputation, about keeping up appearances. And my stepmother had just made sure I was nothing more than a stain on their perfect little world. The grand doors swung open and the cold night air hit me like a slap. The guards shoved me outside and I stumbled forward, catching myself just before I fell. Behind me, the doors slammed shut. Silence. For a moment, I just stood there, my breath visible in the chilly air. My face burned with humiliation. My hands clenched into fists. I had never felt so betrayed, so angry, so utterly alone. And yet, underneath all of that, something else stirred. Excitement. Because they thought they had won. They thought they had thrown me out, erased me, destroyed my reputation in one single night. But they had no idea what was coming next. I wiped my face, straightened my shoulders, and took a deep breath. If my stepmother wanted a war, she was about to get one. This wasn't about fairness. It never was. My father built the business from nothing. He worked late nights, missed family dinners, and poured every bit of himself into making it successful. I grew up watching him, learning from him, understanding what it took to run it. And when he passed away, he left it to me. Not out of favoritism, not by accident, but because he knew I was the right person for the job. It was legally mine. His will made that clear. There were no loopholes, no misunderstandings. But my stepmother and Clara refused to accept it. In their minds, I didn't deserve it. Not because I wasn't capable, not because I hadn't worked for it, but because I wasn't one of them. They always made sure I knew I was different. I didn't belong to their world of extravagant galas, fake smiles, and whispered gossip over champagne. I didn't care about designer labels or exclusive social clubs. I cared about the company, about keeping my father's legacy alive. But to them, none of that mattered. Clara, with her carefully curated image of a perfect daughter, was the one who should have inherited everything. Not because she ever worked a day in her life, not because she knew the first thing about running a business, but because she fit their idea of who should be in charge. She had the right connections, the right last name, the right presence in their social circles. And then there was me, the stepdaughter, the one who didn't fit, the one they whispered about at events, always wondering why my father ever married my mother in the first place. the one who, in their eyes, was only there by mistake. They hated that my father saw past all of that he chose me over them, that he didn't care about high society rules or bloodlines. He cared about who could actually run the business. And yet, despite the will, despite the law, they still acted like I was some kind of thief, as if I had broken into their house and taken something that was rightfully theirs. They spread rumors, turned people against me, made me out to be a fraud. They wanted to erase the truth and replace it with their own version of reality. But what they never understood was that the truth doesn't disappear just because they choose to ignore it. And now it was time for me to make sure they could never ignore it again. 2 hours. That's how long it took me to pull myself together, make a few phone calls, and set everything in motion. When the ballroom doors slammed behind me earlier, I stood outside in the cold, humiliated, furious. But I wasn't defeated. If my stepmother wanted to turn my life into a spectacle, I was more than happy to return the favor. But this time, I wasn't coming back alone. When I walked through those grand doors again, heads turned immediately. The music was still playing, people were still drinking, and laughter echoed through the room. It was as if nothing had happened, as if I had never even existed. But the moment they saw me, the mood shifted. The whispers started up again, but this time they weren't filled with blind judgment. This time they were uncertain, curious, maybe even a little nervous. Because I hadn't just walked back in, I had arrived. On one side of me was my lawyer, his sharp suit and confident stride making it clear we weren't here for a casual chat. On the other side were 2 well-known reporters, their press badges visible, notebooks already out. And behind me? A few key members of the company's board, men and women my father trusted, people who actually understood the business, people who knew the truth. I didn't need to make a scene. I was the scene. I scanned the crowd, searching for her. It didn't take long. My stepmother stood near the stage, a glass of champagne in hand, mid-laugh with a group of her so-called friends. Clara was right beside her, still playing the part of the innocent victim. But the second they noticed me, their smiles vanished. For the first time that night, they looked afraid. I walked forward slowly, my heels clicking against the polished floor, letting the weight of my presence sink in. My stepmother straightened, trying to regain her composure, but I could see the way her grip on her glass tightened. Clara took a small step back, her eyes darting to the reporters. She knew what this meant. I stopped in the center of the room, giving everyone a moment to take in the scene. Then, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, I said, "You wanted to talk about stolen things? Let's talk about the truth." The room fell into absolute silence. I could feel the tension thick in the air. The guests who had booed me earlier now looked between my stepmother and me, realizing that maybe they had picked the wrong side. My stepmother opened her mouth, probably to protest, but before she could speak, my lawyer stepped forward holding up a stack of documents. And just like that, the real show began. The second I stepped onto the stage, the energy in the room shifted. People weren't just watching anymore, they were waiting. Waiting to see what I was going to say, waiting to see what was about to unfold. My stepmother and Clara were frozen in place, their fake confidence starting to crack. They knew something was coming, but they had no idea just how bad it was going to be. I took a slow breath, then spoke clearly, my voice steady. My father left me the business. That is a fact. It was his decision, written in his will, signed and legal. But what if I told you that someone tried to change that? A few gasps, whispers, nervous glances between guests. I kept going. What if I told you that my stepmother attempted to forge new documents, that she tried to rewrite my father's final wishes, to erase me from what was rightfully mine? I let the words sink in. Then, I reached for the stack of papers my lawyer handed me. And guess what? I held them up. I have proof. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rustling of fabric as people leaned in, their curiosity overpowering their loyalty to my stepmother. A few guests whispered to each other, shifting uncomfortably. They had been so quick to believe her, to boo me, to throw me out. But now they were realizing they had backed the wrong horse. I turned my gaze to my stepmother. She was pale, gripping the edge of a nearby table like she needed support. Clara, standing beside her, looked like she wanted to disappear. I continued flipping through the pages. This is a forensic report confirming that the signatures on this version of my father's will. I held up another document, one she had tried to use to claim ownership, are forged. Another wave of gasps. These are emails between my stepmother and a less than reputable lawyer discussing how to alter legal documents without raising suspicion. Clara shook her head wildly, her voice a high-pitched whisper. "Mum, tell them this isn't true." But my stepmother wasn't saying anything. I held up the final piece of paper, my voice unwavering. "And this is a confession from the lawyer himself, admitting that he was paid to do it. That was it, the final blow. I didn't need to say anything else. The evidence spoke for itself. The guests started murmuring louder now, the whispers turning into full conversations. Some of them looked disgusted. Others looked entertained, like they were watching a scandalous movie play out in real life. A few who had thrown insults at me earlier now avoided my gaze, ashamed. I took a step closer to my stepmother and said, just loud enough for her to hear, "You tried to destroy me. But now you've destroyed yourself." And just like that, the truth was out. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what I had just revealed hung in the air like a thick fog. You could almost hear the gears turning in people's heads as they tried to process it. Then, the gasps started. Sharp, scattered, some louder than others. A woman near the front covered her mouth in shock. A man in a tailored suit shook his head, whispering something to his wife. A few guests turned to each other, their expressions shifting from disbelief to realization. And then, the whispers. "I can't believe it. She forged documents? All this time we thought she was the thief." People looked at my stepmother, their admiration crumbling right in front of her. Just an hour ago, they had been on her side, nodding along as she humiliated me. Now they were looking at her like she was a stranger. I turned my eyes toward her. She had gone completely pale, gripping the edge of the nearest table like it was the only thing keeping her standing. Her perfect put-together mask had cracked, and underneath, she looked exposed. But Clara was still performing. She blinked rapidly, her face crumpling as if she were about to cry. Then, right on cue, she let out a choked sob. I didn't know, I swear, I thought..." She trailed off, looking around desperately, waiting for someone to comfort her. No one did. The same people who had once fawned over her, who had whispered behind my back, who had cheered when I was thrown out, now they just stared, some with pity, others with disgust. But none of them were buying her act anymore. A woman I barely knew stepped forward hesitantly. I'm so sorry," she said, avoiding my eyes. We didn't know." Another man nodded, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I think we all owe you an apology." I let their words hang in the air. A part of me wanted to laugh at how quickly they switched sides, how easily they distanced themselves from the woman they had just been defending. But another part of me felt satisfied. Not because I needed their approval, but because now, finally, the truth was out, and my stepmother had no way to bury it. The room was still buzzing with murmurs, but I wasn't paying attention anymore. I had said everything I needed to say. The truth was out. The damage was done. And the best part? I didn't have to do anything else. I turned to my stepmother, who still stood frozen in place. She looked smaller now, stripped of the power she had always carried so effortlessly. The confidence, the smugness, it was all gone. She wasn't the grand hostess anymore. She wasn't the queen of the evening. She was just a woman who had been caught. I took a slow step toward her, making sure she felt every second of it. The room was so quiet I could hear the ice clinking in someone's glass. Then, in a voice calm and steady, I said the words that would haunt her forever. Return what isn't yours. It wasn't just about the company. It was about everything. The lies, the manipulation, the way she had tried to erase me from my father's legacy. She had spent years treating me like an outsider, like I didn't belong. But in the end, she was the one who had no place left to stand. Her lips parted like she wanted to say something, an excuse, a defense, maybe even a desperate plea, but nothing came out. There was nothing she could say. Not this time. I let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of what had just happened. Then, without another word, I turned around and walked away. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked out with my head high, my heels clicking against the floor, leaving her behind to deal with the wreckage. As I reached the exit, I glanced back one last time. Clara was still standing beside her, but she wasn't clinging to her anymore. She wasn't even looking at her. The people who had once circled my stepmother like loyal followers were slowly stepping away, like they didn't want to be caught in the fallout. And then, I pushed open the doors and left. The cold night air hit me again, but this time, it didn't sting. It felt fresh, freeing. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the crisp air, feeling the weight of years of manipulation and betrayal finally lift off my shoulders. But the real victory? That came the next morning, because by sunrise, the scandal was everywhere. News articles, social media, gossip columns. Everyone was talking about it. About the forged documents, about the betrayal, about the grand birthday gala that had turned into the biggest humiliation of the year. And my stepmother. She was the headline. She had spent her whole life trying to control the narrative, making sure she was always on top. But this time, she had no control at all.